So I am looking into, the question is about censorship of textbooks. And I think one of the fascinating things, because it's absolutely true, there are a lot of textbooks that intentionally curate out things or intentionally create lies. There was that great big controversy about Jefferson being removed from the narratives of US history in Texas textbooks recently. And I think one of the things that this kind of history shows, because in the larger project we're looking at not only the Inquisition, but we're looking at censorship in medieval universities, and we're looking at censorship in the USSR, and we're looking at censorship in Argentina, we're looking at censorship in a huge range of bodies. That kind of censorship of textbooks, where you've made information disappear and made other information appear, is a very Orwellian form, is a distinctly modern form, and is an unusual form. And one of the things I think this helpfully does is make that stand out. The censorship of material we perceive as being for children has always been one of the centers, if not the center, of censorship's self-justification. When Plato says we need to kick Homer out of the city, it's because Homer will give kids the wrong ideas about the gods. And there are lots of things that we think of as, yes, we shouldn't let a kid have the thing. It's not good for a kid to have that. It's one of the arenas of censorship, much like hate speech, that we're readiest to concede and least likely to battle, which makes it one of the ones that I think we need to look out most for. One thing I didn't have time to talk about was the role that science fiction and fantasy have played in the history, not only of censorship, but especially of efforts to subvert censorship. Because in a lot of ways, genre fiction, because it's looked down on and taken less seriously than real fiction, is often censored less thoroughly than realistic fiction. And for a long time, it's been possible to discuss things in science fiction contexts that you weren't allowed to discuss in mainstream contexts. So for example, after World War II, you couldn't talk about the war in the Japanese press. You couldn't talk about the war partly because the American occupation government was very sensitive, partly because Japan's own government and people were very sensitive. And you had a couple of decades. You really couldn't talk about the war freely in the Japanese press until the later 1970s, or 1968. So you had a full decade where you can't talk about the war. At the same time, you have a generation of kids who have lived through the war, who have lost their families and their siblings and their homes in the war, who had no school because of the war, because the school system effectively shut down and turned into either a military academy system, or if the kids are over 12, they go off to the factories. So you have a set of kids who have had no historical or political education and desperately need to understand what just happened, what caused what just happened, why are my parents dead, why is my city rubble? And no one could answer that. But in Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy, you have stories about anti-robot racism and anti-robot hate crimes and nations whose governments exploit anti-robot sentiment, exploiting and deluding their people into going to war and going into wars of aggression, justified and built around what isn't called racism because it's about robot rights, but what absolutely slips through the censors because this is just a fluffy kid's story about robots. And when you read the memoirs of that generation, the generation that were between 10 and 15 at the end of World War II, they all talk about Tezuka's Astro Boy and other early stories as being the thing that made them feel for the first time they understood what the war had been and how to try to build a constructive and positive future out of it. And you could not have done it if it was built as a real-world Earth story. But he could do it because it was built as a science fiction story. And in a lot of spaces, especially in the modern world, genre fiction is the haven of more honest conversations when we're scared to have the more direct one, especially for children. Yeah.
But given that we theoretically at least learn from history, doesn't that mean future censorship will be casting more of an eye on genre fiction?
Maybe. The question is, will future censorship cast more of an eye on genre fiction because we realize genre fiction has this special immunity? Maybe I would even slide into yes if you look at the American Library Association's annual statistics on which are the most frequently banned and challenged books in the US. When you look at those statistics for the past several decades, the front runner by a huge margin is Harry Potter, the most frequently banned and challenged work in the US. There is also a disproportionate amount of censorship affects comic books. All around the world, not just in the US, but also in Africa and Japan and all over the place. An enormous percentage of the most frequently censored and challenged works are in the form of comic books or graphic novels. Partly because there is a tradition of using these for political satire in the newspaper strip form, and partly because we associate these with children. And we are most comfortable censoring things in the name of children. That's the form of censorship we feel most comfortable with. And there was a fascinating moment in my classroom toward the beginning of this quarter where we were talking about the Inquisition, and we were making comparison to modern stuff and the comics code, and one of the students said, yeah, but the people who are doing it now sincerely believe it's for people's good, which is not like the Inquisition, right? And the answer is no. The answer is they always thought that it was sincerely for people's good, even at the same time that it is constructing these narratives of power and of legitimacy. People don't sit down to go, wah ha ha, I want to exert a narrative of power over people by making them cross out Erasmus's name on a thing. They believe that they are defending people against a kind of danger, and these motives layer into. Now, sometimes people do sit down to create totalitarian control, mostly in the modern world where we have literature about totalitarian control to model those activities on. But the vast majority of censorship is done by people who sincerely believe it's a good idea at the time. Which is why we always have to watch ourselves whenever we think, you know, I never want to read anything like Ultra Gash Inferno again. I would be so okay with that knowing. That's the slippery moment. Yes?
Okay, when you're talking about censorship, but when you talk about Stalin and Hitler, that censorship is specific political or evil purpose.
Well, from their perspective, it's a good purpose. Now, I agree it's an evil purpose. And from the perspective of the Inquisition, I mean, I think they shouldn't have censored anything. It would be much better. From their perspective, it's a good purpose. And I think that distinction is important to recognize. That from the perspective of the people doing it, they believe that there is a specific good that comes out of it, and that that's a common characteristic of censorship. We are out of time, but you had your hand up before.
Yes, I'm comfortable with calling the modern model Orwellian because it bears a certain, because what Orwell himself did and what Stalin and what his model in Russia did bears a certain resemblance to your description of the Inquisition. They were dealing with what the outer party can read. They were reserving copies for the inner parties. And they didn't care about the and they did, and above all, they weren't worried about fascists. They were worried about a former member of the party, Emmanuel Goldstein. So
one of the things that I think is that you're absolutely right about and is important to point out in these circumstances, Orwell's model in 1984 when he reads it absolutely does have this three-tiered inner party, outer party proles and deal with them differently in terms of expectation of what they're doing and what they're reading. When we repeat Orwell's narrative, that drops out. Right? That's not in the 1984 Macintosh commercial based on this. That's not in Terry Gilliam's Brazil. It's not in the imagined Orwell that we take home with us, even though it's in Orwell, who has a very incisive sense of real-world censorship based on his experiences, among other things, in Britain under World War II, where there were complex and unanticipatable, very vaguely defined forms of censorship, where things could be suddenly defined as sedition that you yourself had not ever imagined could be sedition. And he has a gorgeous essay, which you can get in Irving Ho's collection called, confusingly, Orwell's 1984 by Irving Howe. But there's a wonderful essay by Orwell in there on the fact that, and he's writing this in the 70s, well after the circulation of 1984, reflecting on how he'd just been invited to be the keynote speaker at a conference on free speech, and nobody was willing to directly, straightforwardly praise free speech or criticize the British government for violating it. And he was like, guys, I wrote 1984, you're here because I wrote 1984. You invited me here because I wrote 1984. And yet, there's this creepy silence about actually criticizing the government. This is not okay. Orwell, in distinct from the Orwellian image that we take from him, is a really rich field of study. Thank you for bringing that up. And now, alas, I'm out of time. I must rest before concert. Thank you all again.